This session is being recorded, and by continuing, you are agreeing to be recorded throughout the session. We are going to have an opportunity for questions and answers at the end of the session. And so we do ask that you take notes as you go along and/or pop your questions in the chat so that we can address them toward the end of the training. My name is Renee Akins. I utilize she, her pronouns, and I am the Director of Contracts, Compliance, and Risk Management here at KCRHA. And I'm also joined today by my co-host or trainee, Tiffany Brooks, who will introduce herself now as well.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tiffany Brooks. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Deputy CFO here at the KCRHA. Welcome to the training.
Thank you. So our agenda for today, and in order to facilitate our time limitations, we're asking that folks go ahead and drop in the chat your name, the agency that you are from, and if you'd like to also include the pronouns that you utilize, that will be helpful as we get to the question answer session at the end. We're going to go over our training goals and objectives. We're going to talk a little bit about indirect versus direct costs. We're going to also talk about cost allocation and cost allowability. We'll touch upon negotiated indirect rate agreements. We'll talk about de minimis rate, and then we're going to share with you a tool that will be available to you. We've created an indirect cost calculator. And then we'll wrap it up, as I said, with a question and answer period. So at the end of this training, you will know the difference between direct versus indirect costs. You will have a better grasp of what are allowable versus unallowable indirect costs. You'll also have clear direction on when to use your federally negotiated rate and how to calculate indirect using de minimis. Okay. So we have a little equation here to get us started off. And direct costs plus your indirect costs equal the true costs of your services or your programs. Okay. Per 2 CFR Part 200.413, direct costs are defined as those costs that can be identified specifically within a particular final cost objective. In other words, direct costs are those costs that are directly attributable to the performance or provision of services for a specific project or organizational activity. In this case, those contracted services that you are providing on behalf of KCRHA. Some typical examples of direct costs may include salaries, wages, and benefits of employees that are providing services directly to clients under the grant, materials and supplies used directly by the grant, travel expenses, which can include travel used to provide services to clients and for required training by direct service staff for the provision of these direct services. It can also include equipment that's used in the provision of the services for the grant. And it may also include rent and occupancy square footage used by the direct staff or used in the provision of services for the grant, right? And that's only if the allocation determined to assign the cost specific to the grant has been allocated to a direct cost. And this is not an all-inclusive list, but it is an example. And you will note that the key term here is directly related to the provision of services for the grant. Okay. Direct costs can also include administrative costs, so long as those administrative costs or activities are, again, directly attributable to the project, and they must be accorded consistent treatment via a written cost allocation plan. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So, for example, a cost cannot be assigned to a federal award as a direct cost if any other cost incurred for that same purpose in like circumstances has been allocated to the federal award as an indirect cost otherwise, right? So it's like you can't attribute it based on your allocation plan, oh, for this grant, I'm going to say our occupancy rates for the building, the rental rate that we use for the building we use to provide services. In this case, I'm going to assign it as an indirect cost. And then, but for this grant, I'm going to assign it for a direct cost. Your allocation plan must be consistent, and it must be consistently applied across all grant types. And it's actually not just federal, but that is the federal standard. And for additional information and guidance on that, you can see 2 CFR Part 200.405. Okay. So again, administrative costs can be claimed as direct costs when they are when they're directly tied to a cost objective. And these are some examples of some of those costs that are administrative costs that may be tied. And one of the things you're going to notice we get further is these are some of the same costs that you're going to see that potentially can be charged to indirect. But again, that cost allocation must be consistent, and we're going to get a little bit more into that as we go along. So as you can see here, we've identified property insurance, rent and utilities, office supplies, office space, utilities, postage, administrative support, such as clerical support, and general and facility costs, right? Directly tied to meet the objectives of the program, right? Okay, now we're going to talk about indirect costs. So per 2 CFR Part 200, Section 414, indirect costs are those costs incurred for a common or joint purpose benefiting more than one cost objective and not readily assignable to the cost objectives specifically benefited without effort disproportionate to the results achieved. That was a lot of words, right? So in other words, basically we're saying indirect costs are those costs that are not readily identified with a specific project or organizational activity for the defined project, but it's incurred for the joint benefit of both projects and other activities. So a broad example of that would be like executive salaries, right? So your CEO provides works as it relates to all of the program services you provide, not just the ones that may be funded by KCRHA, right? And so a pro rata share of that executive salary can be attributable as an indirect cost based on the indirect cost calculation. So other examples of indirect costs for many nonprofits include depreciation on buildings and equipment, costs of operating and maintaining facilities, general administrations, such as the salaries, again, of executive officers. That's the example I gave, personnel administration and accounting. It could be office supplies, office space, utilities, postage, administrative support, such as clerical support, property insurance, and then again, you see rent and occupancy, square footage used by direct staff or used in providing services for the grant. And as you can see, this list is very similar to those that were identified in the direct costs. But these again are generally administrative activities. Okay. For major nonprofit organizations that are federally funded projects, indirect costs must be classified into 2 categories. That's facilities and administration. So facilities includes things such as depreciation on buildings, equipment and capital improvements, interest on debt associated with certain buildings, equipment and capital improvements, and operations and maintenance expenses. Administration is generally categorized as general administration and general expenses such as the director's office, accounting, personnel, and all other types of expenditures not listed specifically under one of the subcategories of facilities, right? So what doesn't fall under the facilities will generally fall under administration for major nonprofit organizations that are federally funded. And for more guidance on that, you want to see 2 CFR Part 200, Section 414A. So what are some of our key takeaways for the information that I just shared? When you think in terms of direct, indirect, facilities, and administrative costs, right? So your key takeaway one is there is no one size fits all use for any of these terms. Many organizational types and many structures, and they range from the small to the large nonprofit conglomerates, and also includes local and state governments. Cost accounting methods will vary based on the organizational structure, and the program costs that are charged as a direct program cost by one organization may be charged as an indirect cost by another organization based on their structure, right? But what is paramount to remember is within an organization, they must be consistently charged as either indirect or direct based on your cost allocation plan, and it must be standardized across the board. So for all grants, you have to apply the same methodology, and it has to be documented in writing as a part of your internal controls, policies, and procedures. Key takeaway two, in all cases, they must also be allowable based on the fund source and per uniform guidance. So per the OMB guidance, they have to be reasonable and necessary costs. They have to conform to limitations or exclusions based on that particular fund source or program type. They have to be consistent with policies and procedures for federally and non-federally financed activities, applied with consistent treatment, and Part 200, Section 403C and 200, 403D kind of tie together as it relates to documented policy and procedures and consistent application of those. And then they must be determined according to generally accepted accounting principles, otherwise known as GAAP. And generally, they cannot be included as match or cost share for any federally funded program unless you have written documentation of federal approval. And that's usually going to be a part of your negotiated rate agreement, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And again, all costs, in all cases, must be adequately documented. Okay? So there are generally three acceptable methods to request reimbursement of indirect costs. And I've alluded to some of them as we've gone through, right? One is your cost allocation plan, which is a part of your internal control documents. It's an annual dollar amount per department or program is the general structure for that. Also, your negotiated indirect cost rate agreement, otherwise known as NICRA, and it's the rate to apply to direct projects. Then there's the de minimis rate, so otherwise known as the 10% de minimis rate, but we're going to have to change that language, right? So for any awards that are issued by October 1st, 2024 and thereafter, the percentage of the modified total indirect cost rate, it was been increased to 15% de minimis. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the cost allocation plan. And basically, as I've alluded to before, it's a plan that summarizes in writing the methods and procedures that your organization will use to allocate your direct and indirect costs to various programs, grants, contracts, and agreements. And there are three acceptable methods to calculate the indirect cost rate in a cost allocation plan. There's the simplified allocation method, multiple rate allocation method, and direct allocation method. So here's a chart that's giving us some highlights as to what each allocation methodology generally looks like. So with the simple allocation methodology, the organization has only a single function, and all programs benefit equally from the shared costs. And the payment is governed generally by the terms of the grant document or the legislation authorizing the program. Federal awards are not generally material for this. Multiple rate allocation methods all programs don't benefit equally from shared costs. So the indirect costs are pooled and then they're allocated to direct objectives based on various distribution bases. In a direct allocation method, all costs are charged directly to programs except for general administration. And then there are various bases are selected to directly allocate the costs to the programs. For example, space allocation based on square footage occupancy. There is another where they do space allocation. It could be based on the percentage of FTE for the staff that are assigned to that specific space. And so you can get more insight as it relates to the 3 methodologies for cost allocation plans under 2 CFR, Part 200, Sections 414E, and the appendices. And actually, all of these are hyperlinked. We're going to provide these slides to you. And there you can get, and if you go to that CFR, there's a hyperlink to the associated appendix. Negotiated indirect rate agreements are used by both governmental and nonprofit entities who receive federal awards, and they can negotiate indirect cost rates with their cognizant agency for use across all federal awards. And so in the case of you agencies that are contracting with us, generally it's going to be your federally negotiated rate, while as a pass-through entity, KCRHA and a regional authority has the ability to negotiate indirect cost rates. We are a young agency, and so we're not yet at a point where we're doing that. And so you would then be bringing your federally negotiated rate if you had one. So the cognizant agency in this case is the federal agency that provides the highest dollar value annually in awards to your organization. If you have a federally negotiated rate, then you must apply the federally negotiated rate across all of your federal awards. And that's kind of what you see in Flux, where we say, do you have a federally negotiated rate? You say yes or no. And if you're applying, you have to apply it across all of your federal awards. In some instances, your federally negotiated rate can also be applied to non-federal KCRHA fund sources that you receive through your awards through us. So in that case, you can also apply your federally negotiated rate, even though it's not an actual federal award, and that would be at your election. It's not a requirement. Okay, some examples of those fund sources that you would receive from KCRHA would be the Consolidated Homelessness Grant, also known as CHG. It's a state fund, and it allows for the application of federally negotiated rates if you have one, right? And then if you don't, then there's a default rate that would be applied. And we'll talk about that a little more, and that's basically going to be the de minimis standard. For Seattle General Funds, which is a local fund, it also allows for the application of actual indirect costs, and it doesn't have a limit. So that necessarily includes your federally negotiated rate if you choose to apply that to that fund source as well. King County Regional Affordable Housing Program, otherwise known as RAF, it also allows for the application of federal negotiated rate because it is governed by CHG rules. Therefore, the CHG rules would apply, and you can use your federally negotiated rate at your election. And again, these are examples. It's not an all-inclusive list. Little known facts that some folks may not be aware of. Having a negotiated indirect rate also allows you to use a portion of your unrecovered indirect costs, like your administrative expenses, as a match requirement, right? So this is a good tool and a resource for those agencies that don't have cash readily available to provide match and would not then normally be applying for COC funded programs or ESG because both of those programs require match. So basically that means that if you had indirect costs that you could normally charge for that particular fund source and you elect not to charge that or seek that reimbursement for us for those costs, you can use that dollar value as your match. So the difference between the amount charged to the federal award and the amount that you could have charged, if you're electing not to, it can be used as your go towards your match amount. And this is subject to prior approval of the federal agency, or in your case with us as your funder, it would be the pass-through entity, KCRHA. So now we're going to talk about the modified de minimis rate, and Tiffany is going to lead this portion of the training.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'll go over the modified de minimis rate. In addition to that, we'll shift over to the indirect cost calculator that we've put together to help you guys calculate your indirect costs for the 3 different methodologies, as well for the different fund sources that you could receive from the KCRHA. Your modified de minimis rate is based off of your based off of the uniform guidance, and it's based off of a 10% currently for contracts that were initiated prior to October 1st, 2024. For any contracts that are being awarded and issued after October 1st, 2024, the modified total direct cost, which is also the de minimis rate, will shift to 15%. You do not have to have a negotiated rate to use this one, and it is the standard default that is used for federal awards. You can just click through the, thank you. You do not have to currently have or have received a negotiated indirect cost rate. It is not a state, local government, or Indian tribe receiving more than $35 million in federal funding. You can use this rate if you your rate is indefinite. This rate is indefinitely used and is consistently applied for all of your federal awards once your entity decides to use this rate, unless you decide to apply for a negotiated federal rate. And then at that point, you would transition from using the de minimis rate to using your federally approved negotiated rate. And it must be used, and it will comply with the 2 CFR 200 Part 403 and the factors that are affecting the allowability of costs, meaning that you will have requirements when you're using the de minimis rate to ensure that the costs that you are including in there are allowable costs within there, and you're excluding the costs that should not be included. Some of those items that are included for the de minimis rate, it does include direct salaries and wages, applicable fringe benefits, materials, supplies, travel, and subawards. When you're using it for subawards and subcontracts, you have to keep in mind that it's for up to the first $25,000 for those awards. And then after October 1st, if you receive an award with us that has a starting period or performance period for October 1st or later, then it shifts from $25,000 to $50,000. Some of the items that are excluded are listed here. I will not go through all of the items that are here, but I will go through the most applicable items that we see within our invoices from providers. And that includes equipment, rental costs, scholarships and fellowships, participant support costs, a portion of each subaward and subcontract that's above $25,000, again, shifting to $50,000 for awards that are initiated after October 1st. And other items may be excluded when necessary to avoid serious inequities in the distribution of indirect costs and with the approval of the cognizant agency for indirect costs and requirements. We will now shift over to walk you through how to use the calculator that we've developed for you. This is intended to help you calculate your indirect cost rate, especially as we begin to shift over to a new grants management system. We just want to make sure that you have a tool that is readily available to you to help you with those calculations as we get ready to renew 2025 contracts. So I am going to take over the screen. And hopefully I do it correctly, so please be patient with me. And if Renee, if you can confirm, you can see the calculator.
Yes, we can see it.
Perfect. All All right, as Renee mentioned earlier, we are first going to go through the indirect cost calculator that can be used for your state and local fund sources that you receive from the KCRHA. I will note, similar to what Renee said earlier, if the fund source that you receive does allow you to use your federally negotiated rate, you can use that rate for your state and local funds. And so when you are completing this calculator, you'll simply enter in that rate instead of the de minimis rate or the other rate, cost allocation rate that you would be using if you use that in your methodology. Each of these calculators, it's 3 tabs, and they will include an introduction of what to expect from this calculator. So this calculator is to guide and to assist our providers to accurately calculate your indirect costs for non-federal funds that are administered by our agency. And if you have a federally approved rate, you can use that here. We try to limit the steps to 3 to 4 steps so that it's very easy to use and very straightforward. Over here is where you would input your information and the calculator will calculate for you automatically. For your non-federal award, you will enter that amount here where it says user input. You will put your rate here, and if you have a federally approved rate, you will enter it there as well. If you have a federally approved rate, exclusions in your agreement, then you would need to list those exclusions here and enter the dollar amount here. When you enter that information, and I'll do a sample of it, so we'll do an award amount of $100,000, a rate of 24%, and we're going to assume that there are no exclusions. It will not calculate any exclusions, and then it'll simply give you what your calculated indirect cost rate is, and then it'll give you a summary to help you do your budget allocation. So you'll do your budget allocation based off a direct cost of $76,000, and then you would include your indirect cost of $24,000 for a total of $100,000 award. However, if you have a federally approved rate, if you had any exclusions, let's say such as your CFO and any executive salaries, you would include them here. You would enter that dollar amount. And that's way too high because we're only doing 100,000. We're going to do $150, something that's really simple for this dollar amount. And it will give you your modified rate. So it's going to decrease your amount by this $300 to show that your base that you're doing your indirect cost calculation off of is truly $99,700 as opposed to the $100,000, and then it'll do the calculation for you down here. So I am going to undo all this. The calculator is ready for your use, and we'll go over to the de minimis tab. Similar to what we just did with the exclusions on the state and local tab, you will have that also in your de minimis tab. It follows the same format of your introduction, your instructions, and it gives you a little bit more information about de minimis, and it also refers you back to the guidance to where you can get more information. Further below, it does provide you with a quick snapshot of typical exclusions so that you can have that right in front of you while you're doing your calculations. The difference with this calculator is it does have you break down a summary of your direct cost. So you would enter your total award amount, a summary or this roll up of your direct cost here. And then you would enter your exclusions right here, and it will exclude your excluded costs. It'll give you a total for your direct, it'll give you a total for your excluded, and then it will calculate a modified rate based off of your award amount less your exclusions, and then it will calculate how much will be your your indirect cost rate based off of the amount that you enter here for the de minimis indirect cost rate. We would have done a hard coding of 10%. However, due to the recent change, we did not want to block any agencies that will be using this calculator for any awards that you're receiving after October 1st. So we left it open so that you can either enter the 10% or the 15%. But keep in mind, if you are currently doing an amendment to any of your current contracts, you will still utilize the 10% rate if you're using it, and you will then transition to the 15% after the start of the year for your contract renewal for 2025 contracts. As mentioned previously, once you enter in that rate, it will then do a calculation to your modified cost, and then it'll give you your direct costs for you to budget, your indirect costs for you to budget as well, and then it will tie back to your total award amount, that you have above and that you've entered above. For your federally approved rate, for your federal funds that you receive dollars from the KCRHA for, this calculator, again, follows the same process of giving instructions. Due to your federally approved rate being a little bit more involved, we're giving you more information on what is your negotiated rate, how is it determined, your unique agency. Each agency will have different rates as well as different exclusions, depending on how and what you included in your application when you apply for that federally negotiated rate. If you do not have access or have the agreement readily available, you can reach out to your sponsoring agency and they should be able to help you obtain a copy of your federally approved rate agreement. And then further down, it just provides you with the guidance and where you can go to get additional information within the 2 CFR 200. Due to the left side being so long, we actually shifted the instructions to the top so that they're right in front of you while you're doing your calculator. And this one is fairly simple. It's entering in your total award amount, your negotiated rate, any exclusions that are identified in your agreement. If you need to add more rows, you can do so here by simply highlighting the two cells, right-clicking, insert, and then you want to shift the cells down. It'll shift the cells down. However, after you do that for however many lines you need to add, you will need to double-click on this total to ensure that you are including all of those extra rows in your calculation. Once you do that, it will then calculate your base by taking your award amount less your exclusions, and it'll give you that base amount. It will then take your indirect cost rate that you received from your federal negotiated rate times the base amount, and then it'll give you what your indirect amount is, and then a summary of your direct cost, your indirect cost, and again, the total award should match what you entered above for your total award above. So we will now shift back over and answer any questions that you.
And I am going to reshare before we do that. Well, I will, Tiffany, I need your permission to reshare. Or I think you have to stop sharing for me to reshare. Lovely picture. Okay. So we want to advise you that within this are also, we've included a list of other resources that can help guide you as you're seeking to learn more about indirect costs and your indirect cost allocations for the various fund sources. There's the Indirect Cost Toolkit for COC and ESG programs, COC eligible activities, indirect costs, and this is a link to the HUD exchange. There is on the State Consolidated Homelessness Grant, CHG grant, there's guidance within that guideline as well. And then we also have the King County Consolidated Homelessness Grant, which is a modified version of the state. And so that's applicable to any of your King County pass-through CHG funds. And they also include an FAQ as well. All of these resources, this training slide, as well as a video recording of this, will be available on the KCRHA website. Our comms team is right now feverishly working to redesign a grants management resource page that will be available to all of our agencies, and there you will find this training and additional training resources as we develop them and roll them out. There will also be a calendar of upcoming trainings and annual trainings that we will be conducting in partnership with compliance, contracts, the finance and budgeting division, as well as potentially some program trainings as well. Okay. And so now we will move to our question and answer period. And I am currently not able to see the screen because we will navigate back to slides as requested by your questions. And so Tiffany, if we have any questions in the chat and or as folks raise their hand, if you could acknowledge them, that would be very helpful.
Sounds good. Currently, we do not have any questions in the chat, and I do not see anyone's hand raised.
Did we do that well, folks? That there are no questions? And again, if you don't feel comfortable coming off mic and speaking, please do feel free to post your question in the chat.
I do have a question. Hello, do you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Please proceed.
I just want to kind of like double check. On the indirect cost number 3, it calls like row rate 10% and 15%. It's only for federal awards. Just want to make sure I understand correctly. Yes? Yeah.
It's for federal awards. However, if you have a state or local fund source that you are using and its guidance indicates that you can use the de minimis rate, then you can use it for those as well.
Oh, they have to let us know which plan we have to use, right?
Correct.
Oh, okay. Okay. The state and locals has to let us know which plan we can use one of those 3.
Correct.
And you'll also get that
Okay.
guidance from us as well. And as a matter of fact, when you see that indirect calculator, I don't believe Tiffany shared that out. We will have kind of another tab that'll be the kind of the rate sheet to give you some general guidance. So for example, for the CHG fund source, you can apply your federally negotiated rate if you have one. If you don't have a federally negotiated rate, and that's a state fund source, right? The default for that is de minimis. And so if it's for an award that's issued prior to October the 1st, it's going to be 10% de minimis. If it's an award that was issued after October the 1st or on October 1st or thereafter, it's going to be 15%. So that is a case where there's a state fund where 10% de minimis is applicable because it's the default. ESG, you can afford, oh, that's a federal fund. That's not a good example. Let's use another one. RAF. Again, if you have a federally negotiated rate, you can utilize it. The default for RAF is de minimis. I have to stop saying the 10% because it's about to change, but it would be de minimis. For City of Seattle, you can elect to use that one is not 10% because actually with City of Seattle general funds and actually Seattle general funds and local Seattle city fund streams, it's basically actual with no cap. And so most people, and it would be most advantageous to elect to utilize theirs as opposed to using the de minimis rate because that is giving you, in fact, a percentage when you could actually have actuals with no caps with Seattle General.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. I just want to clarify all these changes because sometimes it's even asking question we're still kind of stuck, especially in the beginning. Hard to. Okay, thank you so much.
Absolutely.
And I would like to double check. I believe this recording and everything will be sent via email, correct?
Yes. You'll receive a follow-up email with the link to the recording and a link, and we'll also attach the slides. So you'll have the slide share available. And then we'll also be linking to our KCRHA Grants Management Resource page that'll be developed. You'll receive that in the email as well.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
And the calculator will be accessible from the website as well.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I just want to recognize that we may have some members from our agencies here that may be new to your organization. If anyone is fairly new or within your organization, joined your organization within the last 6 months, could you drop your email in the chat so that we can ensure that you receive these resources as well? And Renee, we do not have any questions in the chat still, and no hands are raised.
Okay. All right. Just wanting to highlight and reiterate again, because in practice, these are some things that we've noted that comes up. Recognizing that de minimis is a modified calculation, right? And so as you're using the calculator, that'll provide greater ease. And then also wanting to confirm again, as it relates to the application of 10% versus 15%, for your current performance period, meaning it's active for 2024, the award was issued prior to October the 1st, 10% de minimis still applies if that's what you're applying, right? Only those awards that are issued for a performance period of October 1st and thereafter will you then be able to apply the 15% de minimis. And for the most part, for agencies that are contracted with KCRHA, that means you will not be able to apply that 15% increased rate until your 2025 renewal. The only exception would be those COC renewals that are happening October 1st and thereafter of this year, because those performance periods run counter calendar. And we're just going to pause just to give a few more moments if anyone has any questions. And we will say you may go back and think about it and decide you have other questions, right? And if you do, we want to make sure that you send an email to compliance@kcrha.org, and you will receive a response to your questions there. So that is always an available resource. And as a reminder, we have open office hours every Thursday from 3 p.m. to 4 p.m., where you're able to come on and ask questions, not just related to this training, but any questions you have related to your contracting process, invoices, etc. We will have a team of staff there available to support you. And with that, we want to thank you for joining us for this session. Please keep an eye out. We plan to reschedule the training that we had to cancel on Tuesday. So we're going to look for another date for that. And then just generally speaking, other upcoming sessions that you can look forward to, in addition to the regular info session, is we will still be holding listening sessions, what we categorize as our feedback sessions for the comprehensive monitoring process for 2023, as we look to roll into comprehensive monitoring for 2024. And again, you will be able to find a calendar of our upcoming trainings on the website. So check it often, and there will be a grants management resource page. That's what you're looking for. Thank you.
Just to highlight before we head out that when you do receive the meeting or the training notification that Renee mentioned that will be a makeup from earlier this week, it will be this exact same training. So if you've already attended today, you do not have to attend the next.
Absolutely. And that's really just for there may have been other folks in your team who wanted to attend and weren't able to. Again, the recording will be available, but they may want to come on to ask questions. And so just know that that is an upcoming resource that'll be available to you as well. Thank you so much for joining us today, and have a wonderful rest of the day and weekend. In fact, tomorrow is Friday. This is Friday Eve.
Thank you.